So today I'll be presenting work that Hamed Bukhamseen and I have done under the title of our practice, Civil Architecture. I'll be speaking primarily about the Kuwait Pavilion, which we had done in 2016, and time willing, touching upon another project which we had just completed in Oslo. And these projects are presented under the common thread of shared waters. Water here being a body, literally a body of water, but also the space in which bodies move. It's a subject, but also it's a place through which subjects pass, and it's a resource. And it's these questions which pervade the work, and also linked to the two previous presentations. But ultimately, the presentation is not about water itself, but about what Guattari would term the ecology of bad ideas. He says an ecology of bad ideas is like an ecology of weeds. And the interest here is really to, through the language of water, through the looking at the Gulf as a body of water, to tackle the increasing, particularly in this region, instrumentalization of architectural practice and architectural thought as a tool of watering and propagating bodies of knowledge that we find problematic. And so looking at shared waters, in this case, is a way of ultimately avoiding land. Land as its own kind of discourse, but ultimately a trap of the real estate market as the ultimate client for architectural thought, which it should not be. So I'll be speaking about the Kuwait Pavilion, called East and West the Gulf, Between East and West the Gulf. Particularly boring title for a pavilion, but I hope that by the end of the presentation it'll be clear why that is the title. And as with any lecture on the Gulf, we have to begin by locating the Gulf on a map of the world, or at least how the world sees Dubai, or perhaps how Dubai sees the world. And in this case, the world is a series of islands where each island is more or less the same. You can begin to see Africa, you can begin to see South America, some hints at possible fictitious archipelagos and continents that do not exist, but where capital ultimately moves equally from one island to another. And in this world, as envisioned by Dubai, the world is a series of atolls and sandbars, some which may host David Beckham and some which may not, yet all aspiring to being sold off equally. And zooming into the world, or away from it, we see the Gulf. However, in this case, the Gulf as imagined by O.M.A. Rem Koolhaas in 2006. So preceding the years before the global recession, or this moment in which suddenly our vision for a world united by global capital burst for a second. And in this Gulf, the Gulf is linear. The Gulf is a single line where water is a convenient backdrop. It allows for the figures of the countries and the landscapes of the coast, of the Arabian coast, to be read before ultimately terminating in the ceiling of the exhibition space. And for us, this depiction of the Gulf as a single entity of only a western coast, but also a singular entity whose narrative was a tabula rasa, a blank space for capital development, and whose primary value was a space onto which projections, experimentation can occur. And ultimately, this was the Gulf against which we would imagine a Kuwait Pavilion as a response. And really, this is the Gulf. The Gulf, which exists as a space between two coasts, but really as a space of its own. A space which, from the perspective of Bahrain and for the city-states on the coast, existed for millennia under various regimes, under various agglomerations, whether it's the larger Bahrain region, let's say, or Awal, or other identities. And which for the past 3 centuries, or at least the past 2 under British auspices, as part of a larger empire, and at least in the case of the 1800s, as a sort of suburb which exported pearls out to India and Europe thereafter. And in this context, it's a Gulf which collapses distance, a Gulf where, let's say, Bahrain to Kerala is much closer than Bahrain to Riyadh. And so our notions of capitals, our notions of space, have to be completely remapped as distances were at that point in time, where people were moving from Bandar Abbas to Al-Bastikiya, where people were crossing Shatt al-Arab, back and forth partying, sometimes in Kuwait and going back, as Alia mentioned with Sheikh Khaz'al, partying with the Kuwaitis. And so what's interesting for us is really the Gulf is this shallow body of water, which also is home, let's say, or is the place where 300 islands are located. And these islands, we began to see were constituted a critical part of the imaginary of the region. They were a place for resolving issues. The island was increasingly an ecological, political, and architectural ideal, which was an undeniable part of the history of the region, but also a place where the history of the region became sort of vestigial. There's these points of contestation, points of demarcation of territory in which the island ends up as an afterthought or as a place where people aren't sure what to do with it. But also, we found increasingly the island became this place of opportunities. Either the creation of housing islands off the coast of Bahrain, the vision for Silk City and these islands off the coast of Kuwait, Dubai, and Abu Dhabi with Saadiyat. But not only Saadiyat, but also these islands as ecological reserves. But perhaps the even stranger cases where Kuwait uses Comoros as a way of offloading its bidun, its citizens without citizenship. And so the island became the subject of investigation for the Kuwait Pavilion. The island as a site not only of history and culture, but also of opportunity. And it was through these islands that we can understand not the countries, but how identity, movement, and territory began to unfold through these points in water. And so we began to see the various histories which played out in islands like Taurut, the coast of Saudi Arabia, Passport Island, built as a bridge between Bahrain and Saudi, where, as Mohammed Sumji mentioned, people would be crossing this island and then going over to Jfair. And so these islands really began to hold the hope for these prospects of things that are shared, of things that are isolated, and these moments of exception. One particularly good one in the case of Bahrain is there was this island off the coast which had been used to detain people in the 1940s, 1950s, which at some point became also the summer home of the British advisor to the government. And one particular case of interest is in the 1950s where 4 people in the National Union Committee were sent to this island, and then when they were deemed kind of a little too close, sent then St. Helena and given St. Helenese passports and detained there. And so for us it was interesting that if you were sent from Bahrain, an island, to another island, but then you were maybe too close, you were sent even further to another island that could only be served as a place to house also Napoleon. And so for us this exceeding kind of distance of islands was a subject of fascination. And so we argued for a pavilion which presented a different imaginary of the Gulf through its islands, inviting contributors to present these different histories, and also to use them as a backdrop for these different futures as well. Looking at the islands as places for religious retreat, sites of kind of retreat for women looking to kind of pray for fertility, sites for Danish explorers and French archaeologists to figure out the history of the region, but also to reimagine themselves within their own kind of antiquarian fantasies. Places of extraction, refining, places of recreation to some extent. These are Japanese consultants on Das Island. But also places where sexuality begins to blur and our understanding of gender and isolation also is reinvented. These are soccer teams playing on Das Island where there weren't so many women, so shirts and skins took on its own different tone. And so the pavilion mapped out the islands of the Gulf, all 300, inviting, first of all, writers to present their history. So writers presenting Quiche, presenting Bobian, presenting the various islands of the Gulf and their different histories. And then that produced its own remapping of the Gulf, its borders, its ecologies, its oil lines, and its infrastructure. And for us, the pavilion was really an effort to, to paraphrase Robert Smithson, to make us forget not the past, but perhaps to make us forget the future, or at least the future as it was being written, a future of cycles of expenditure, contestation, and constant crisis. And for us, it was also interesting that perhaps this preceded the Gulf crisis in many ways. And it was an unlikely Kuwait pavilion, largely because we said, we don't really want to show Kuwait. We invited authors from Kuwait, Bahrain, the UAE, Saudi, Qatar, Oman, Iraq, Lebanon, and Iran. And for the longest time, we were sure that it would not happen. The meeting with the National Council for Cultural Arts and Letters in Kuwait happened the same week that Kuwait had withdrawn its ambassador from Iran. And so for us to be saying, well, we've invited these speakers from both sides of the coast talking about how Quiche was an island for gambling under the Shah, how these islands became these points of meeting, we were convinced that it would not happen. And yet, I think one of the things that somehow came through was that the need for cultural enterprises and architectural enterprises not to reinforce existing narratives, splitting the Gulf between East and West, but actually questioning these narratives and providing alternate outlets, both for the various countries, this role that Kuwait historically has played and continues to play now in the Gulf, was really the needed thing, and also what the space of the Biennale offered, ultimately as a space to begin to question the existing narratives through the lens of architectural discourse. And so the pavilion was both the combination of a book showing this history and also a series of proposals by various architectural firms in the region. So ex-architects, I'm just going to mention a few of the contributors. So ex-architects, Design Earth, ISAS, AGI, Rashid bin Shabib, Fatma Sahlawi, Randi Abdel Jabbar, Maythal Mazrou'i, a list that goes on. And really it's these, Fabshar, Ahmed Makkiya, it's this list of contributors which were either reflecting on the past or reflecting on or proposing the future. So the exhibition space was a master plan for a Gulf through its islands, inviting several design firms to reimagine an island in the Gulf, usually ones that are contested between two countries, as possible sites of intervention. Some which would be some contested data centers shared between two countries that couldn't decide over the ownership of an island. Some that were sites for a post-oil future, where islands after they had been used for mining or refining would later be used as sites for either tourism or as ecological preserves. Sites where a bridge could be formed between two islands and a museum could be enacted between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And really the goal here isn't to propose a utopian vision, but to allow an outlet for conversations on ecology, on environment, on the political space, and also ultimately the futures of these islands as places of opportunity to really kind of take these ideas that exist in the Gulf and to put them into the form of a proposal. And so moving from the Kuwait Pavilion, one of the projects we have been working on this past year was shown at the Oslo Triennale. It moves now from the scale of the Gulf as a body of water to our relationship to water as a resource. The project was called, one thing I should say about the Kuwait Pavilion. The bad title was perhaps the only way that such a thing could slip by, like the need for titles that allow projects to go by, and this idea of something as generic as between East and West the Gulf was perhaps the only way that someone could say, yeah, sure, that sounds innocuous enough. And continuing this legacy of bad titles, the next one, the one we presented for Oslo under the theme of degrowth. So the Triennale was looking at ideas of degrowth, ideas for futures that are not centered around the constant expenditure of resources and the growth of cities endlessly. This idea of a world without infinite resources. And it was called 2,000 Years of Non-Urban History. And for us, it was really about having come back to the Gulf. So much of the points of origin either begin right around the time of discovery of oil. Sometimes, if super generous, it begins a little before, talking about either a mercantile past or the exportation of pearls. And we had become increasingly frustrated with the inability of the Gulf to produce a history of planning models, of discourse that actually thinks about how land is organized, subdivided, beyond the sort of ad hoc nature of the Gulf city, which really existed in its autonomy as a fulfillment of a space which was unplanned. I mean, the whole point of the Gulf city was that various tribes, pearling merchants, were able to congregate, conduct business, with the promise of autonomy and, to some extent, protection. And so our contribution was really looking at how planning is the applications of lines and forms onto territory, played out prior to the discovery of oil. And we looked at 3 case studies. I'll be talking about 2. We looked at the desert traps of the Arabian Peninsula, the fish traps of the Gulf Coast, and also the water infrastructure which existed in the Gulf as well. So here you begin to see the fish traps of the peninsula of Al-Had, these 200 to 300 meter long devices built on Satwat al-Balad, as it was called, this area where, because of the flat waters of the Gulf and the fairly calm nature of the waters as well, allow for people to build these infrastructures for catching fish. And what's interesting is, despite them being these sort of technologies that have existed for 3,000, 4,000 plus years, they were built by a rassam, someone who literally a drawer, someone who would draw the plan for these fish traps, would decide their orientation, collect the materials. And we were interested in these not only as these sort of moments of an early vestigial architectural technology, but as these woven fences in the sea, something between that which is woven and that which is constructed. But most importantly, it's also considering these as forms of early land ownership. Fish traps could be bought, sold, loaned. They could be made religious endowment, waqf. And over time, they, over the course of 3,000 years, accumulated all the laws, procedures for trade and dealing that you'd see in agricultural land. And in fact, to this day in Bahrain, you could buy, sell, lease, and register one, although with increasing difficulty, especially after in the 1930s, as the project of places like Jufair became either places for the refining of oil or the places where British soldiers would have their naval outposts, the need to nationalize the waterfront and prevent this, let's say, the creation of common shared fishing facilities or the fish traps, meant that suddenly these things were banned. So several thousand years of shared coastline was made no longer. And although they continue to exist in Bahrain in this form of, you can't buy one or sell one anymore, but you can inherit one. You can register and renew a registration, but you can't register one if you haven't registered it in a while. And you're entitled to compensation based on a 10-year rent, but then the terms become increasingly difficult for these. And so they effectively, all the laws that were placed for these when the British came and helped navigate the ownership of the coastline since have not been updated. And we found these really as an interesting precedent, not only in their ability to provide a subsistence economy along the coastline, but really the way they imagined property ownership and the succession of ownership along the coastline. And they're still used to this day, constructed by these communities. These actually, sorry, going back to some of these is actually Dilmoni couples photographs as well, Hussein and Maryam. And we went out and scoped them ourselves. They're built together by the community. Now they use chicken wire. They used to use palm fronds. They're reconstructed 2 to 3 times a year. And again, you can begin to see both the spatial quality. I mean, this is about 9 feet or higher at the Sur. And you can also see the kind of encroachment along the coastline of various industrial uses, which over time has also meant that these have become unsustainable. So in this case, this is one which has been actually illegal for the last 80 years, but because they've been illegal since the 1930s, they've lasted long enough that no one's actually contested their legality anymore. And so the next step moving in from this coastline, establishing this understanding of these of water and the way in which the coastline is owned, bought, and traded, we did this mapping of all the springs in Bahrain. What makes Bahrain interesting is, I mean, these are the villages. Despite it being a small island, Bahrain has a rural sector. It has a rural economy. The narrative of city and village exists because the city owes its history to, or Bahrain owes its past, to the fact that water was available and farming allowed for life to exist in the country. And so we mapped about 50 or so of the main springs in the island, and also all the water networks which connected those springs to each other, ensuring a consistent water table and water level, and also allowed for farming to occur all along the villages. Most interestingly, however, is that we realized all the ones on the western side of the island were actually not natural springs, but water collection points. And they were all fed by these 2 to 3 kilometer long underground channels, which in the UAE are called CLOG. Most interestingly, however, when we presented this, wasn't the fact that there's this 2 kilometer long, effectively underground highway for water, but it meant that actually water security in these areas was from rainfall, not from groundwater. And so we actually realized that a lot of our understanding of why all the water had run out in Bahrain, why there's no more natural springs, was to some extent a self kind of imposed condition of not only the over abstraction of groundwater, but the complete changing of topography which allowed water to accumulate and be used for other uses. And water which initially had also the infrastructural rights. So although the cities were these spaces of autonomous building, use, and construction, all the channels had those maintaining them. There was a network of employees from people maintaining the springs, constructing the channels, taking the water, and a sophisticated system of jurisprudence of subdividing all the water hours throughout the day. So if your farm was along the spring, you were allocated a specific water hour, you were allocated a specific adjustment of water. And so for us, it was through this exploration of the relationship between the city to this, let's say, the countryside or the villages, that actually revealed not only was the city the space of exception to planning, but actually the landscape was far more urban, it was far more planned, it was far more legally, socially, and economically planned and understood than the cities ever were in the Gulf. I mean, I could go to any farm and see a land deed from the 1400s and it would tell me when I could water it, what it was bought and sold for, and how many fish traps I could trade it for. I mean, there's a reason why in all religious texts from the region, there's these laws about what to happen if your ox ruins your neighbor's farm. This is not only a couple hundred years of legality and farmland, but several thousand years of understood relationship to the landscape. And it was important for us to highlight these relationships because ultimately, within the context of degrowth, it is in this post-oil economy that all these narratives are not only eliminated, but now as we approach post-oil futures, the need to understand land, our relationship to the land, and ideas of planning that aren't centered around extractions of oil and its exploitation, but our ability to share, manage, and equitably divide scarce resources is the history of the region and is the important way in which planning was done. Planning not as the subdivision of land for real estate development, but planning ultimately as a way of ensuring the maintenance and sustainability of scarce resources. And the project was, I'll touch upon this super quickly. We picked a certain area. This is a 2-kilometer underground channel which feeds this area of village of Karzakan, the ad hoc area of Karzakan, but it's pretty well-planned farming area. You see the fish traps there along the coast. And then we worked with a textile artist to fabricate it at a 2.5 meter by 6 meter scale. What's interesting is also she was interested in working in these ways of making textile that were both in Bahrain and also weren't. So from the early 20th century, wood blocks that would have to be made and fabricated in India and used as part of the textile industry in Bahrain. So creating these stamps is a way of showing both in plan and elevation how fish traps are made. And then constructing these 3 tapestries as a triptych. Really questioning also the idea of the domestic interpretation of landscape. I mean, we're so used to the ideal garden as shown in a carpet. And for us, this way of showing it as a quilt, showing not 3 ideal gardens, this personal domain of the individual charbagh or the individual garden, but actually the idea of an idealized landscape, our relationship to water, in the sea, our relationship to water resources, and also in the desert, although I'm not going to touch upon it today. That was a subject of investigation. I've got a copy of the book over there in the bag and would love to show that to you guys also. But yeah, and so for us, really this lineage of moving in from the Gulf and the Kuwait Pavilion to our understanding of water resources and scarcity on the level of Bahrain and the level of the island has been the project. And it's within this context that we look to re-understand the landscape, understandings of planning, and understandings of scarcity in the Gulf. Thanks.